I'm Jason with Saving Sally, and in this video we're going to move on to the second headlight, and we're going to make that repair where, if you'll remember, the first headlight we had an electrical issue, and I showed you how we traced that down and solved the issue. In this video we're going to look at the headlight that has a mechanical issue, and I'm pretty confident that I know exactly what the problem is and how to fix it. So let me show you what's going on. You're going to notice the driver's side headlight is going to open up just like it's supposed to, but the passenger side headlight is going to struggle and it just can't quite seem to raise itself up. So that's what we're going to be working at today. A little bit of assistance. There we go. That takes care of that. Now let's do something about that buzzing. Got me a handy tool set, and I want to go ahead and disconnect the negative terminal of the battery so that we don't run our battery down or shock ourselves or short something out while we're making this repair. And with the battery disconnected, let's get the camera in place and go ahead and get started. So there are going to be 4 screws. There will be 2 on this side and 2 on the opposing side. Now in this instance, someone has lost the original screws. These should be T15 Torx, but in my case, the ones on this side are actually Phillips head screwdrivers. Set these aside somewhere where you won't lose them. And now for the 2 Torx drivers. Now getting this out can be a little tricky. In my case, I wasn't able to come up. I actually had to go down in the front, and then I was able to remove this piece. Now down inside of this, there are actually 3 bolts that are 10mm bolts, and there's one here. There is one down below. I'm trying not to obscure it with my shadow, but it's hard to. And there's a third one right there. I actually think if I had a 10mm wrench, I could probably remove this without having to remove this assembly. But since all I have is a 10mm socket, I'm going to go ahead and remove the headlight assembly so that I can gain better access to this motor assembly. So to remove this assembly, there's a 10mm bolt here. There is a 10mm here as well. And there's a 10mm down below. I'm pointing at it. It's a little tough to get the camera angle, but it's in there. As well as one more way down here in this corner. I'm going to remove those 4 bolts, and then this whole headlight assembly should lift right off. Definitely set these aside somewhere where they won't be lost. Last of the 4. And now at this point I'm going to go ahead and unplug this socket for the motor. And I'm going to leave the one for the light intact. Just be aware that it's here and don't put any undue pressure on it. Let me also say that this car is destined for the paint booth in the not too distant future, so I am not too terribly worried about what I said on what surfaces. But if your car were in great condition already, I would advise placing a towel or something down to prevent any kind of damage to your paint. And now we're going to remove the 10mm nut that ties the actuator shaft to the lever assembly. Set that aside for safekeeping. And with the headlight assembly out and rotated, we have pretty simple access to these 3 10mm bolts that hold this actuator assembly to the headlight assembly. Let's go ahead and remove those. Do note that one of these is going to be a little shorter than the other 2, and you need to remember where they go when you're reassembling. And now my motor should slip off without any trouble. And as is typical with these cars, you're going to find that a lot of these projects are going to go from metric back to standard when you're taking something apart, and this is no exception. The 3 bolts that hold this motor cover on are going to be removed with a 1/4 inch as opposed to something out of the metric family. Definitely put these somewhere for safekeeping. And in my case, this piece lifted right off. Be aware that there are some washers in here that it's possible to lose. You want to definitely make sure that we get those collected up and put them somewhere where we know how to find them. In my case, it looks like there are 4 of them that sit on top of this bushing. And it's pretty much what I expected. There's a powder, like a plastic residue powder inside, and that is from these little bushings that become worn out with time, and they need to be replaced. Looking inside, the 3 little bushings are completely gone, and all we're left with is powder and a little bit of grease on the worm gear. I'm going to clean this assembly up, and I'm going to replace this with some new bushings that I picked up from Hawks Motorsports. There are 3 of them per headlight, so this rebuild kit came with enough to do both headlights. So in my case, I'm just going to use 3, and I'll save the other 3 for when the other headlight decides it's had enough. So here are a new gasket that had come apart when we removed this, and here is my grease, so thank goodness for that. So now let's go ahead and complete this rebuild. I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to this worm gear, just like that. And I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to the teeth. Now I could have done a better job cleaning this out, but the reality is I'm kind of on a tight schedule, and I don't know that I have enough time to do this the way that I would like to do it. So we are going to kind of rush through just a little bit today. I'm going to go back in with the washer. I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to that washer, both sides. I'm going to put my gear down in, and before I seat that fully, I used that just to kind of center that washer. I'll go ahead and apply these bushings. Now with each one of these bushings seated inside of a divot, I will go back in with my gear, making sure to seat the rounded portion around the bushing. We're in. And now this motor goes back together the same way that it came apart. In my case, I had more washers on one side than the other. I'm not sure if that's because someone maybe has been in here and rebuilt this once before, or if this is how this came from the factory. But I am going to put it back how it was, with a little bit of grease in between these washers. And the gasket will only go one way. It'll be pretty obvious to you how it goes when it's time to put this on. So now our 3/4 inch screws go back in. We're going to call this actuator rebuilt, and it's time to go ahead and put it back on the exact opposite as it came off. Starting off with one of these long bolts toward the bottom, one of the long bolts at the top, and the short bolt in what I'll call the center. I'll go ahead and plug this back up. Don't over tighten any of these just yet. You may need to make some adjustments, and it'll be helpful to get the rest of the holes aligned if these screws are still a little bit loose. So now, before I reattach the bezel that went around the front, what I want to do is go ahead and reconnect the battery and close the headlights and make sure that I don't need to make too many adjustments before I reattach the bezel. That looks close enough for what we're trying to do today. Given that this car is destined for a paint booth soon, I'm not going to spend too much time because that'll all have to be readjusted later. So last but not least, I want to go ahead and reconnect this 10mm bolt that came off of the shaft for the motor output. And with that out of the way, we're going to go back in with the bezel, back in with those 4 screws, and we're going to call this project completed. So that wraps up our second headlight, and I'm going to show you how our work has paid off. You're going to see both headlights pop up pretty well synchronized, and both headlights go down pretty well synchronized. So I'm going to call that a win. If you haven't already, I'm going to ask that you go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you're enjoying this rebuild. I got some pretty big things coming in the future for this car, and I'm going to go ahead and head over to a sneak peek of those things right now. Now this is a 383 stroker. I want to go ahead and give a special shout out to my good buddy Lucas with LNF Services. He actually donated a 383 stroker engine to me, but the engine that he had was a cast iron head. There was a lot of unknowns. It was a very high compression, high RPM engine. We're trying to build a high compression, low RPM engine. We're looking for maximum low end torque. So that engine was not going to work. However, we used the rotating assembly and we rebuilt a 350 out of a 1989 Corvette. We have some aluminum heads and we've got the Corvette valve covers. We've got an intake on the way. This 383 stroker is going to be a fantastic power plant for the 1991 Trans Am. And that's going to wrap up this project. And although I just gave you a sneak peek of what's coming for under the hood of this car, I'm going to also have to tell you that I'm being a little bit of a tease because that's a little further down the road than several other small projects that are lined up for this car. So if you don't want to miss what those projects are or this engine when it gets swapped out, go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell. So until next time, this is Jason and this is Saving Sally.